The headlines: tempers run high as the country reacts to the announcement that lockdown is being loosened. Sort of. The Prime Minister is reportedly very unhappy with the criticism he has received. Earlier today, he was caught on tape, remarking, "What on earth are they moaning about? I just gave them the right to sunbathe and do unlimited exercise. You think they'd be thankful for my kindness?" In response, the First Minister of Scotland commented, "That's nonsense. I'm the kind one. I'm keeping my country safely at home and letting them skip work. How compassionate is that? Thank me later, Scotland." "No," said the editor of the Times, "it's we, journalists, who care. We are gifting you with an unfettered avalanche of COVID news." Look, in our defense, there's not a lot else going on. It's either the pandemic or we start covering stupid stuff like Lord Sugar's Twitter feud with Piers Morgan. The fact that you probably haven't heard about that is a proof of our love for you. In contrast, though, many pointed back to VE Day and the Second World War and the fact that it was the compassion and sacrifice of millions of ordinary people that made the difference. "I know it's hard to believe," said one Stubbington checkout operator, "but sometimes those little acts of everyday kindness actually turn out to make the most impact, rather than the sound and fury of the powers that be." Now, stop talking to me, please. You're holding up the queue for other customers. My name's Andy, that's all fake news, and you're watching Alverstoke Antiviral. Well, hello and welcome to Alverstoke Antiviral. I'm joined here with Colin. Colin, do you want to introduce our guests today?
Yes, we have all the way from Gosport, David and Sue Cunliffe. Good to see you, David and Sue.
Hello.
Great to have you with us. We're going to be thinking a little bit about things that are uncertain and some of the anxiety that's to do with that. And you're going to answer a few questions in a few minutes. Andy, did you have anything to ask David and Sue as we start?
Well, if we're talking about uncertainty, are we really going to talk about uncertainty? I'm a little uncertain about where that's going to go.
Who knows?
The whole thing is up in the air.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We thought we'd have a topical discussion for a change. Uncertainty. Take it away.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the current situation has made us all acutely aware of how fragile and uncertain our lives on planet Earth actually are.
Yeah, we have, yeah. And actually, we normally think that life carries on and we work to certainty. We have our routines and nothing ever changes. But actually, what this pandemic is showing us that really the world is much more uncertain than we're used to working with. So, and as a result of that, as I've rediscovered, we get anxious. And anxiety is a fundamental human response to uncertainty. And it's actually a good response because it enables us in a lot of situations to then make preparations to deal with that. The problem in our current day is that sometimes we don't know how to deal with our anxiety.
Do you know, I saw a video recently about someone explaining, it was a comedian explaining the pandemic to their past self. So because it's sort of time travel about, if you could go back and say, this is what's going to happen. And just the unreal amount of change and the unreal change in emotions and moods that we've been through and we're still going through as a country. As we go through different stages, there are different moods, aren't there? And we're in a particular moment now, I think, where there's quite a bit of tension because we're like, well, are we opening up? When's it going to be? It's all if and yeah.
And we were sort of talking about this and we were sort of thinking, I mean, those of us who are old enough to remember, not you, Andy, of course, that you could have perhaps in times past have seen outside a church the notice board saying morning service, 11 a.m, DV. which means Deo volenti, or God willing. And I think that probably comes out of the passage in James chapter 4, where it says this: "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that." So that's kind of where that idea comes from. But does that mean that we shouldn't make plans? We wouldn't get very far in our Western culture if we didn't. So I don't think it does mean that. But I do think it means that maybe we shouldn't hold too tightly to our plans, so that we're not going to fall apart if they don't come to fruition. I think we have to remember that our God is loving and he cares of us, even when everything around about us seems to fall apart. I have to humbly acknowledge, don't I, before God, that his ways are not my ways. And just sort of, get myself into a place, I've got my plans, but it's God who will bring them about or not, and I have to rest with that.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Proverbs, of course, that we make our plans, but it's the Lord that establishes the detail of our steps. And so it's not that we're discouraged from making plans, but we need to, as Proverbs 16:3 says, make our plans with God in mind and commit them to God, so that however they work out, that we actually begin to see God working out his way, which is much better than our way. And then rather than getting distressed that plans change, we can be confident that we are walking in the way that God is directing for us. And then that can have a positive impact on our anxiety, so that when we become anxious, we give that to God. We recognise that it is there. We don't try and run away from it. We recognise that it's there. And we can find strategies for dealing with the problems when our minds are filled with all sorts of things. And if we allow ourselves to reflect on Scripture, bring Scripture to mind that we've memorised, then that can be really helpful. It still might mean that we need to take our medication. And I've had to increase my medication over the last few weeks to help me through the things that were going on in my body as a result of the anxiety. But in all of that, we learn to live, as it were, in God's time and in God's world, rather than isolated from God.
And I mean, it's not, we're not saying that that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, in fact, it can be really hard. And this last week, in fact, on VE Day, we had a little granddaughter who was born up in Yorkshire. And of course, we're very grateful and excited to hear about that news. Now, earlier in this year, of course, we'd made plans to make sure that we were free in May and June, because we were planning to go up to Yorkshire to spend time with our daughter and son-in-law and our new little baby girl, or their little baby girl. So that's all changed. We can't do that, and that is hard. We planned to do that's what we were going to do, and suddenly now forces beyond our control. We're not going to be able to do that. I mean, and I think so knowing that God is in control, it doesn't mean that we aren't very sad that we can't go for a cuddle. Of course we are. And I don't think we should try to pretend otherwise. It's not, oh, God's in control, I'm not sad. I am sad, genuinely sad that I can't see her. But I also do believe that God shares our sadnesses. He wants us to tell him how we feel. After all, he made us for relationships, so it's okay to be sad and to tell him that. And sit with that and just then see what what happens really.
Yeah, so sometimes there is a tension, isn't there, between the emotions that we have. That, on the one hand, we can be sad or angry or happy or anxious, but we don't allow any one of those to define where we are. But we hold them in tension, recognizing that, all sorts of things can be going on at the same time.
Yeah. Yes, so that sadness that I have got not being able to go and see Adia. But yeah, I'm also really happy to have seen pictures of her. And in fact, we had a very short video communication last night, so I have seen her yawning. And I'm really grateful for that, and that's happy. So I can be happy and sad, I think, at the same time. And I mean, things like video calls, wow, I mean, like we're doing now. A few years ago, this would have been completely impossible, wouldn't it? So, Yeah.
I'm really interested about, I wonder, have you got an example of like a scripture passage you were talking about that's the sort of thing that you've come back to? Because I can think of one that's quite useful for this, but I wonder if you have one.
Well, I mean, that's the scripture that I mentioned earlier, isn't it? That God's ways are not our ways and his thoughts are not our thoughts. I think really to sit with that, because so often I can think, I know best, I'm in control, I know what I'm going to do. And it's to be brought up short, no, I don't. God knows. It's that. And I mean, as well in this, I would say that, we've all been really surprised, shocked, taken aback by what's happened with this pandemic. It just happened so quickly, it's like wham. But, God isn't surprised by it or caught off guard. He knew it was going to happen, He knows the end from the beginning. So there's that passage. He knows the end from the beginning. And also that he is the Alpha and the Omega. He controls time. It's not, and I think David said at the very beginning, any idea that we're in control, we know what's going to happen, is a complete illusion. And I think this has really brought us to that,
Yeah. So the one that came to mind for me was in Psalm 139, I think it is. Or is it 137? It's 139, where David comments, all my ways are known to you. And we had that song in the Sunday stream recently that was new by City of Light. And they do a song called All My Ways Are Known to You. And it's talking about, you understand when I sit and I rise and I walk around. So everywhere you go, it's the idea that those ways are known and under God's protection, and under his knowledge and his care. And when you stop to think about it, you realize there's no place you can go to in life if you belong to God through Jesus. There's no place you can go to where God doesn't know that way where you are and doesn't know what you're going through. And doesn't understand it as well, which is a deep comfort, I think.
I think I like that idea, that the phrase that you used then, that we're under God's protection, because I think often we sort of say God is in control, and that can sound a little bit, be a bit misunderstood. But I think the fact that we're under God's protection, and that whatever happens, when we walk through the waters, he'll be with us. Through the fire, it won't consume us. It's that kind of idea that these things will happen to us as his people, as they do to everybody. We're not taken out of those things, but we are. He is with us in the midst of the waters, flood and the fire and everything. And we have to hold on to that.
Yeah, so we need to remember when we're going through these things and call to mind that God is with us. Because often the problems that we're in, the issues that we're facing, so overwhelm us, we forget that God is there with us already.
Yeah. Have you got any thoughts on this, Colin?
Well, I was thinking of Jesus. We were talking about, Sue and David, you were talking about going through the fire and the flood. And we know that Jesus himself went through a tremendous conflagration, if you like, and a baptism of fire. And he talked about that beforehand. So he's, and we see in him that incredible confidence in God in spite of all that he's going through. And and so that sometimes, when we turn our eyes to that hymn, helps us to recognize that our situation, though it's big to us, he's gone through so much more, and he's with us as we go through our fire or flood, or however we want to describe it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, that sets us up wonderfully for Ruth as well, which is what we're going to talk about for the rest, because that's a very uncertain situation in which God does a lot of amazing things. Yeah, but thank you so much,
promise
guys.
you, Andy, I promise
Sorry?
you, Andy, that wasn't planned, was it?
I don't think it was. No. And yet it just sort of happened. Well, that's a case of got something, yes. Well, David and Sue, thank you for joining us. That's a very thoughtful contribution, which I'm sure people appreciate. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
see you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Right, Colin, we're going to talk about Ruth. And in terms of uncertainty, Book of Ruth is one of those books which it's really short, isn't it? So it's the sort of book people might actually read, which sounds awful, because let's be honest, lots of people don't read the Bible in the world today, sadly. But Book of Ruth, there's no excuse, is there? Because there's only 4 chapters. And I think it's in a bit of a contrast to some of the books around it, because some of the great history books of the Bible, they talk about kings and heroes and prophets and all these exciting people. And the Book of Ruth is very small scale, isn't it? It's about ordinary people. And the main characters are, the main characters are women. One of them is a foreign woman. They're widows. And it's about the ordinary business of marriage and foraging for food and immigration and bereavement and the sort of typical turmoil you might go through in the course of life at that time. And so it's very, very sort of homely in the sense it's quite small scale. It's about the little people. And just to kind of go over it, the thing about the Book of Ruth is it starts with these, it basically focuses on these 2 women, Naomi and Ruth. And it starts with death. So chapter 1 starts in the days when the judges ruled. So the bad days of all the chaos that we saw last time. In those messy days, there was a family in Bethlehem who went to live in Moab because there was a famine. And basically, everyone dies in the family. The husband and the sons die. And all that's left is the mother and daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And it's a tragedy. It's bereavement, it's famine, it's a survival situation. And widows, obviously, in this period are very economically and socially vulnerable. They don't have people around them to protect them, it seems, apart from themselves. And they have no husbands to produce more children. So the family looks like it's going to die out, basically, which is a disaster for them. And what happens basically is it starts in this very depressing, tragic situation where Naomi decides she's going to return to Bethlehem because there is food in Bethlehem, which is fitting because Bethlehem means house of bread. And so there's a famine in Bethlehem which drives them out, but then there's food in Bethlehem. So he comes back to Bethlehem. And the big shock of Ruth 1 really is that one of the girls sticks with her, which is an absolutely crazy decision. In the context of what's going on, because Orpah eventually goes away and goes back to her family and her gods to have to find another husband and carry on a life. And Naomi, this Moabite woman, throws in her lot completely with Naomi Ruth. And did I say that? Yeah, I did. Yeah,
you said Naomi, but Ruth. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for clearing that up. Yes. And Naomi thinks this is bonkers. It's absolutely, humanly speaking, bonkers, because you're throwing yourself away from your family and your people and everything, and you're chucking yourself in with me, your mother-in-law, okay, not the most usual behavior in the world, let's be honest, and I'm not going to produce any more sons for you to marry, so I don't know why you're sticking with me. I don't know why you're clinging to me. Surely your future is better off elsewhere. And amazingly, Ruth says no, and we get this amazing statement of faith. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you will go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And that's an extraordinarily strong pledge of loyalty to Naomi. And also notice it's to Naomi's God as well. Your God will be my God. I'm not going back to my family and my gods like my sister-in-law has done. I'm going to throw in my lot with the God of Israel and with his people. And it's a big, well, it's not, I suppose you could describe it as a leap of faith, but it's a big punt to throw herself into the strange country and throw herself on the mercy of the God of Israel. And this is what Boaz comments about it later. He says, Ruth 2:11-12, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland. Now, does that language remind you of anyone in the Bible? Leaving your father and mother and the homeland? Colin looks confused.
You're thinking of Abraham?
I was thinking of Abraham too.
Yeah, okay.
But that journey of faith, that leaving of the earthly home in pursuit of God and his promises and his blessings. And that's what Ruth does. She leaves what she knows and she comes to this people she doesn't know before. And he says, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. It's a beautiful image of refuge under God's wings. And that's what Ruth is doing. It's about a Moabite woman, a Gentile, coming to take refuge in the God of Israel. And what is going to happen to her? What is going to happen to her in the story of the book? What will the fate be of those who throw themselves as refugees upon the God of Israel? That's the big tension of the story. It's a very uncertain situation, so it fits with what we were seeing before. And what we see is how God treats people who throw themselves on his mercy. And I've got a very exciting slide for this. It's a double idea, I would say. And it's a double idea is this. What we see in the book of Ruth, after Ruth comes and throws herself upon the God of Israel, is that God shows steadfast love. And he does that in two ways, which plug into each other. He does that through sovereign control of events. And he does that through the steadfast love of his people, whose character mirrors his own. So there's a double idea there. There's the idea of God showing steadfast love. How does he do that? He does it through sovereign controlling events. And that's worked out on the ground through steadfast love of his own people, whose character mirrors his own. So we see God's love shown through the love of people who act like him. That's what really happens in Ruth. Because what happens is that she goes out foraging in fields for food, because you're supposed to leave some scraps for people in the time of Judges, basically it's a very risky situation. In the days of Judges, a single foreign woman is roaming around in fields trying to pick barley with all these working men in a time where there's no king and everyone's doing what they see fit. And it could go horribly wrong. And yet, in God's sovereignty, whose field does she end up in? She ends up in the field of Boaz. And Boaz is very, very kind. He's very, very kind to her. He takes her under his protection. He finds out who she is. He speaks to her. He gives her food. He makes sure she can forage there and collect stalks to feed herself. He tells his workmen to respect her. He tells them to give her a drink and let her refresh herself. And he says, don't go anywhere else. You might come to harm. You can stay in my field. In other words, she comes by the sovereign hand of God to the safest place she could be. And she comes under the protection of this man who is kind and whose behavior shows God's steadfast love. And God's steadfast love is shown for her through the kindness of Boaz. And the big shock is as well that we see not just the kindness of Boaz, but we see the kindness of Ruth as well being used to bless Naomi, because then the story goes, well, everyone kind of ends up blessed out of this, because what happens is that Ruth then marries Boaz, and it happens because he is the kinsman redeemer. He is one of the kinsman redeemers. He is related to Ruth's dead husband and therefore has an obligation to reboot Naomi's family by marrying her, producing an heir who will inherit Naomi's estate. So this dead family, which has run out of people and is left only with a couple of widows, has a chance of a future and a baby. And that happens because Ruth marries Boaz. And it's very striking. They go to Ruth comes to him in the threshing floor at night and makes this appeal to spread his garment over her because he is the kinsman redeemer. And Boaz comments on this, and he says, you are acting with great kindness. And it's this term steadfast love, which is often used in the Bible. It's chesed. It's the idea of God's steadfast love, which people can also show. It's loyal love. It's reliable love. And it's a sort of love which God shows to Ruth. And Naomi comments on that as well. She says, God has not, I think it's talking about God in chapter 2, he's not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead through bringing Boaz into their life. And Boaz says, Ruth, you are showing enormous kindness because you haven't run after young men, rich or poor. You have shown enormous kindness in offering yourself in marriage to the man who can reboot Naomi's family and help your mother-in-law. It's an enormous act of kindness. And Boaz is also kind because he then goes and redeems her and marries her. And that comes at a cost because we find out in chapter 4 that the other guy who could redeem her doesn't want to do it because there's a risk to his estate if he produces another heir because he buys a field and then he has to give it to the child rather than his own existing children, one presumes. So it comes at a cost to diminish your estate to produce this child. But Boaz does that. He takes that on himself and he redeems the estate and he marries Ruth. And the book ends with a baby, just like we've been hearing about the baby. The baby Obed is born. It's a great baby name, which Colin hasn't yet used for one of his children. And we get this amazing sort of comment at the end about what is going on. So this is, that's Naomi's speech. This is Ruth 4. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He, talking about the baby, I think now, will renew your life and sustain you in old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Ruth is better than 7 sons to Naomi. Why? Because she is kind and gracious and loving. And her simple everyday acts of loyalty and protection of Naomi and looking out for her interests, not her own, has blessed Naomi. And it's this idea that God's love is shown to Naomi. Naomi is taken from this place of death and mourning where she's called Mara in the first chapter because she's bitter and her life is a mess, to this point of joy at the end where she has the baby on her knee and her family has a future. From death to life, from bitterness to joy, from emptiness to fullness. That journey happens through the kindness of God, reflected through the kindness of his people who image his character. And I think that sets us up for truths of the gospel in so many ways, partly because it points us to the fact that how do we experience the love of God? How do we benefit from it? We benefit from it through God's people who share his character, particularly the one who is the image of the invisible God, the exact representation of his being. We benefit through Jesus, who perfectly exhibits God's love to us and his character. And through his compassion on us, we experience the love of God. And of course, as the Spirit transforms us and makes us more like him, we ourselves become compassionate, like Boaz is compassionate, like Ruth is compassionate, and show this kindness and benefit each other. And I bet many of us can think of examples of people and Christians who have shown God's love to us and been enormously compassionate and helpful to us at certain times. I can remember a funeral where everyone was going on about the kindness of the deceased, how they've been kind. And I think this is a real application for us, Colin, isn't it? Because we need to know the kindness of God in Jesus. And we need to also be transformed into the kindness of God when we are forgiven and transformed by his Spirit. And there's a sense in which kindness is an underrated virtue today. Would you say that's the case?
I think so, along with quite a few other of those sort of quieter aspects of a person's character. Because kindness tends to be quite quiet. It's not done loudly, it's done thoughtfully and intentionally, but often other people don't know about it apart from the person who receives it. Yeah.
And it's so everyday as well, isn't it, with Ruth? Because it's just ordinary people in the business of feeding and taking care of each other and acting for each other's interest because they know God and they are transformed to be like him in character because they know his love. And yeah, I mean, can you think of an example of someone who's been kind to you, whose kindness you've really appreciated?
So Yeah, I had a friend drop in on me a couple of months back. He gave me a ring, said he was down in the area. Could he pop in? And he did, and it was a really enjoyable time with him, really refreshing. And I was really glad that he thought of me, actually, and decided to come in. Yeah. So there was an act of kindness. Yeah.
And isn't that important to remember that actually what is going to, where are we going to see the love of God worked out in a situation like our own situation? Is it going to be in the great acts of the mighty people, or is it actually going to be in the mundanities of your life, my life, our lives? You know, we don't think of our lives that way, do we? We don't think we matter. We don't think our lives have meaning generally, and we can think it's all just a waste and going to nothing, rather than actually God is sovereign and he works out his plans through the everyday compassion of his people, and he makes his love known. And I wonder if God is doing that through our lives, and I wonder if we're praying for that to be the case, and I wonder if we're looking for ways to show this kindness to others as well.
Because when we first started just this talk on Ruth, it made me, is that Ruth in the same position in the Bibles that we have as it would have been in the Jewish Bible? No. Okay. But even so, in the Bible that we're familiar with, you've got all of that topsy-turvy, violent, horrendous behaviour that's going on in Judges, with marvellous rescues as well. But it's a very uncertain time, and there's some uncertainty when you get to Samuel with who's going to be king and who's going to lead the people out of this. But in the middle of it, you have got this very ordinary picture or situation in some sense. It's like a still pool in the midst of sort of horrid terrain that you come across, and you realise actually, you know, there is more going on here. There is a refreshing activity of God happening that actually is at work in amongst all that uncertainty, and out of this will come something really beneficial for the people of God.
And someone, because how does the book of Judges end? Israel have no king, la 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 la, as the Lion King says, and everyone does what they see fit. How does the book of Ruth end? Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David.
Yeah.
And we get a genealogy right at the end to show us that from this Moabite woman and the minutiae of her life comes Israel's king, and God's plan to put things on the right course and bring about his kingdom through his good king. And who would have thought, if you could have gone back and said to Ruth that you are going to be in the genealogy of King David and Jesus Christ, Savior of the world, she wouldn't have believed it, would she?
No.
But that's a pointer to God's sovereign compassion and his control over events, and a reminder that God is at work in our situations, in our confusion and our uncertainties, to bring about his purposes. So let's be thanking him for that. That's pretty much all I've got to say on Ruth. So until next time, stay close to Jesus.
And wash your hands.